Welcome to Life Stories, where we share tales that inspire, teach, and move us. Today, we bring you an extraordinary encounter in Central Park, a moment where prejudice met resilience, and an act of injustice gave way to powerful lessons of compassion and integrity. Join us as we delve into the story of James Brown, a legendary boxer who reminded everyone what true strength and courage look like. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to follow today's incredible journey. It was a serene morning in Central Park, the kind where the sunlight filters through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the green grass. The air was crisp, filled with the sounds of children laughing, joggers' rhythmic footfalls, and the occasional bark of a dog chasing its tail. Among the bustling activity, James Brown, the legendary former heavyweight boxing champion, sat quietly on a worn wooden bench, dressed modestly in a hoodie and jeans. He blended into the scenery, his fame and formidable past almost invisible to the casual observer. James cradled a small bag of birdseed in one hand, gently scattering it with the other to a growing flock of pigeons at his feet. He watched them with a soft smile, his expression peaceful, even tender. It was a side of him that few people ever saw, the man who found joy in simple things, like feeding birds in the park. Occasionally, a passerby would glance at him, some recognizing his face but hesitating to approach. Others walked by, oblivious to the presence of a man whose name was once synonymous with raw power and unyielding will. As James tossed another handful of seeds, a young boy darted into view, his bright red sneakers skidding to a halt a few feet from the bench. The boy's face lit up with awe, his excitement barely contained. Are you James Brown?" he stammered, his small voice trembling with disbelief. James turned toward the boy, a slow, warm smile spreading across his face. "That's right, kid," he said, his voice deep and rich, carrying the weight of years in the ring but softened by an unmistakable kindness. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated, his cheeks flushing pink. "Ethan," he said finally, almost shyly. "Well, Ethan." James chuckled. "You want an autograph?" He pulled a notepad and pen from his pocket as if he had been expecting this moment all along. With a few swift strokes, he scribbled his name on the paper, handing it back to Ethan with a wink. The boy beamed, clutching the autograph as though it were the most valuable treasure in the world. From a short distance, Ethan's mother called to him, her voice tinged with both urgency and gratitude. "Come on, Ethan. And thank you, Mr. Brown," she added, her tone sincere. James nodded in acknowledgement, watching as the boy sprinted back to his mother, his excitement infectious. It was a brief, heartwarming encounter that reaffirmed something James had always believed: true strength wasn't just about winning fights, it was about connecting with people, especially the young ones who looked up to him. However, not everyone shared James's view of the world. Officer Reynolds, a regular patrolman in Central Park, approached with the same cold demeanor he wore every day. His mirrored sunglasses reflected the landscape, giving him an unfeeling, almost mechanical presence. As he rounded a corner, his gaze landed on James, sitting peacefully amidst the pigeons. To Reynolds, James wasn't a celebrated athlete or a kind man quietly enjoying the morning. No, in Reynolds's eyes, James was just another loiterer, another troublemaker who didn't belong in this part of the city. Reynolds muttered under his breath, his lips curling into a sneer. "Just great. Another one loitering around here," he grumbled, his voice dripping with disdain. His hand rested on his belt, near his holstered baton, as though ready to assert his authority at the slightest provocation. As Reynolds approached, the pigeons scattered in a flurry of wings and feathers, startled by his aggressive stride. James remained seated, his body language calm but alert, his eyes following the officer's movements. "Hey!" Reynolds barked, his voice sharp and commanding. "You can't just sit here all day. Move along." James raised an eyebrow, his voice steady and unruffled. I'm just feeding the pigeons. Man. Is that a crime? Reynolds bristled at the response, his irritation boiling over. Don't get smart with me, he snapped. Stepping closer. I said. Move along. The tension was palpable, like a coiled spring ready to snap. A small crowd began to form, drawn by the escalating confrontation. Whispers rippled through the onlookers, their curiosity mingled with unease. James, however, remained composed, his tone unwavering as he replied, I'm not bothering anyone. Just enjoying the park like everyone else. But Reynolds was not a man easily swayed by reason. His frustration morphed into anger, and his voice lowered to a growl. I don't care who you think you are. Get up now. He loomed over James, his body language brimming with hostility. For a moment, James said nothing. He simply met Reynolds's glare with a steady, unflinching gaze, his calmness a stark contrast to the officer's growing rage. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. It was the kind of moment that could change everything, the clash of two men. One wielding authority, the other embodying resilience. And in that moment, the park seemed to hold its breath, the cheerful morning giving way to a tense, unfolding drama. Reynolds' irritation was mounting, the veins in his neck pulsing as he took another threatening step closer to James. I said. Get up, he barked, his voice rising above the murmurs of the gathering crowd. A few onlookers exchanged worried glances, their unease growing. To them, this scene was spiraling into something far worse than a mere disagreement over park benches. James, still seated, adjusted his posture slightly, his shoulders relaxing as though he were preparing for something inevitable. His voice remained calm, yet his words carried a firm resolve. You're making a mistake, he said, his deep tone resonating like a warning. I've done nothing wrong. Reynolds scoffed, his fingers now resting on the handle of his baton. Mistake? You're the one who doesn't belong here. His words were biting, laced with an unmistakable prejudice. Move. Now. The crowd grew restless. A middle-aged woman clutching her purse leaned toward a man beside her. Isn't that James Brown? She whispered, her voice barely audible. The man nodded, recognition dawning in his eyes. Others began to murmur, and the realization spread like a ripple through the spectators. Reynolds, oblivious to the shifting tide of awareness around him, was too consumed by his own authority. His patience snapped like a brittle twig, and in one swift motion, he pulled out his baton. Before anyone could intervene, he brought it down on James' shoulder with a sickening crack. Gasps erupted from the crowd, the sound cutting through the air like a blade. A few people stepped forward instinctively, their faces a mixture of shock and horror. James grunted softly at the impact, his body stiffening as he absorbed the blow. He stayed seated, his gaze locked on Reynolds, his eyes dark and steady, unflinching. Is that how you solve your problems? James asked, his voice low but carrying enough weight to hush the murmuring crowd. By hitting someone who isn't even fighting back. Reynolds hesitated, momentarily thrown off by James' composure. You should have just listened, he stammered, his earlier bravado faltering. His grip on the baton tightened, though his confidence wavered. James rose slowly from the bench, his imposing frame towering over Reynolds. The crowd collectively held its breath, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Despite the throbbing pain in his shoulder, James moved with deliberate precision, his every motion measured. He stood face to face with Reynolds, the officer's height suddenly seeming insignificant against the former boxer's undeniable presence. You didn't have to do that, James said, his voice carrying a mix of disappointment and restrained anger. All I wanted was to sit here and enjoy the morning, like everyone else. Reynolds took a step back, his earlier aggression replaced by a flicker of doubt. I'm just doing my job, he muttered, though the words felt hollow even to him. James tilted his head slightly, studying Reynolds with a penetrating gaze. "Your job," he said, "is to protect people. Not to intimidate them. Not to attack them without reason." A child's voice pierced the tension. "Why did the policeman hit him?" "Mom." A little girl clung to her mother's hand, her wide eyes brimming with confusion and fear. Her mother shushed her gently. But the question hung in the air, its innocence more damning than any accusation. James glanced at the girl, his expression softening. He then turned back to Reynolds, who seemed smaller now, diminished by the weight of the crowd's judgment. "You're not just wearing that badge for yourself," James said. "You're wearing it for everyone here. For that little girl. And right now, you're showing her the worst of what it means." Reynolds opened his mouth to respond. But no words came. The crowd was no longer murmuring, it was silent. Watching. Waiting. In that silence, the power dynamics had shifted. James Brown was no longer just a man defending his right to sit on a park bench. He had become a symbol of strength, dignity, and justice. Reynolds' face flushed, his uncertainty now plain for all to see. He glanced around, his gaze darting from James to the crowd. The people were no longer passive observers, their collective presence was a force, a silent condemnation of his actions. And in that moment, James Brown stood firm, an unwavering reminder that true power comes not from brute force, but from restraint, empathy, and unshakable integrity. The story was far from over, but already, the lessons were beginning to take root in the hearts of everyone watching. The air in Central Park was heavy with tension. The crowd, now numbering at least 24, formed a loose semicircle around James Brown and Officer Reynolds. People whispered in hushed tones, some clutching their phones, recording the scene unfolding before them. Yet James remained composed, his towering figure a beacon of calm amidst the rising storm. Reynolds' grip on his baton faltered slightly as he took another step back. His mirrored sunglasses slipped down his nose, revealing his eyes wide and betraying the fear he now felt. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The crowd's silent judgment pressed down on him, a weight he hadn't anticipated. James took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate, like a lion closing in on its prey, not with malice, but with a confidence that could not be ignored. "You don't have to be this way," James said, his voice low but firm. "You don't have to prove anything to me or anyone else here." Reynolds' lips twitched as he tried to maintain his authority. I'm just doing my duty," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The words felt thin, hollow, even to himself. "Is this what duty looks like?" James countered, gesturing toward the baton still clenched in Reynolds' hand. "Striking someone who's done nothing wrong? Intimidating people instead of serving them?" His tone wasn't accusatory but steady, as if he were trying to reach something deeper within Reynolds. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A man in his 30s, standing near the edge of the gathering, stepped forward. "His right," the man said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "We all saw what happened. He was just sitting there." Others nodded, their courage bolstered by the man's words. A woman chimed in, her voice firm. "You attacked him for no reason. That's not what a cop should do." Reynolds turned toward the voices, his face reddening. "Stay out of this," he snapped. Though his tone lacked its earlier authority, the once powerful officer now seemed smaller. His presence diminished under the collective gaze of the onlookers. James raised a hand, silencing the murmurs with a single gesture. "It's not about them," he said, his eyes locking onto Reynolds. "It's about you and the choices you make. Right here. Right now." For a moment, there was only silence. Reynolds' breathing grew heavier, the baton trembling slightly in his grip. He looked around, his gaze darting between James, the crowd, and the small girl who still clung to her mother's hand. Her wide, innocent eyes seemed to pierce through his defenses in a way no one else could. James' voice softened, his tone carrying an almost fatherly warmth. "You can walk away from this," he said. "Put the baton down. Show these people. Show that little girl that you're better than this." Reynolds hesitated, his grip loosening on the baton. His jaw clenched as he wrestled with his pride, his fear, and the faint spark of something that James' words had ignited within him. The crowd watched, the tension nearly unbearable. Then, as if in slow motion, Reynolds lowered the baton. He let it hang at his side, the gesture tentative but unmistakable. The crowd exhaled collectively, the oppressive weight in the air lifting slightly. James nodded, a small but genuine smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "That's a start," he said. But the moment was fleeting. A ripple of commotion moved through the crowd as another figure emerged, a senior officer, his badge gleaming in the sunlight and his face etched with stern disapproval. His voice boomed across the park. "Reynolds, what's going on here?" The crowd parted, making way for the commanding presence of Captain Mitchell. His sharp eyes scanned the scene, taking in Reynolds, James, and the silent onlookers. His expression darkened as he processed the unspoken truths hanging in the air. James stepped aside, his posture relaxed but his gaze unwavering. "Captain," he said evenly, "you might want to ask your officer that." Mitchell's eyes narrowed as he turned to Reynolds, who now looked as though he wanted to melt into the ground. "Reynolds," Mitchell said, his tone cold and cutting, "start talking." The crowd waited, their collective breath held once again. Whatever came next would decide the course of the day and perhaps the future of the Badge Reynolds War. As the sun set over Central Park, the day's events left an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed them. James Brown's calm yet firm stand against prejudice wasn't just a personal triumph, it was a lesson in empathy, self-control, and justice. He showed us that even in moments of confrontation, it's possible to rise above anger and embody the values we wish to see in the world. This story reminds us that our choices, big or small, define who we are and the legacy we leave behind. If you found today's story inspiring, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Life Stories for more uplifting content that celebrates humanity's courage and kindness. See you in the next video.